He thought handing her a broken piano would make everyone laugh. But in less than 10 seconds, no one in that room would ever look at him the same way again. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or state in the comments below. And if you believe respect should never be based on appearances, make sure you like and subscribe. Now, back to Clara Whitmore. The theater glowed under warm golden lights, its polished marble floors reflecting the soft shimmer of crystal chandeliers that hung like frozen constellations above a room filled with wealth, status, and quiet judgment. The kind of place where every suit was tailored, every whisper calculated, and every glance measured worth before a single word was spoken. On that stage, beneath a spotlight that seemed almost too bright for comfort, stood Daniel Hargrove, a name that carried weight in every elite music circle from New York to Los Angeles. His posture was perfect, his smile practiced, and his confidence unmistakable. He wasn't just performing tonight. He was commanding the room. The audience adored him, not just for his talent, but for the aura of superiority he wore like a second skin. And yet, just a few feet beyond the glow of that spotlight, where shadows softened the edges of reality, Clara Whitmore moved quietly across the stage. Her presence was barely acknowledged. A simple gray cardigan hung loosely over her frame, her worn sneakers silent against the hardwood floor as she carefully wiped down the edge of a grand piano that hadn't been touched in years. To most people in that room, she wasn't even a person worth noticing. She was part of the background, like the curtains or the dust she was cleaning. Invisible, replaceable, safe to ignore. Daniel noticed her, though not in the way that mattered. His eyes flickered toward her briefly, a faint smirk forming as he leaned slightly toward the microphone. There was something about her simplicity, her quietness, that seemed to invite dismissal. And in a room built on perception, that was all it took. "You know," he said casually, his voice echoing through the theater with effortless control. "Even that old thing over there could probably make a sound if someone tried hard enough." A few people chuckled, their laughter light but sharp, like glass tapping against glass. His gaze shifted more deliberately now, landing directly on Clara. "Hey," he added, gesturing toward her with a subtle flick of his hand. "Why don't you give it a try? Might be entertaining." The room reacted instantly. Heads turned, eyes locked. A ripple of curiosity spread like a wave through the audience. Some leaned forward, others exchanged amused glances, already anticipating the awkwardness that would follow. Clara paused mid-motion, her hand still resting on the piano's edge. For a brief moment, she didn't move, didn't speak, didn't react. The silence around her felt heavier than the laughter that had come before it. She slowly looked up, her eyes meeting the stage lights for the first time that evening. There was no anger in her expression, no embarrassment, just stillness, the kind of stillness that made time hesitate. "Go on," Daniel pressed lightly, his tone playful but edged with something sharper underneath. "It's just for fun." More laughter followed, louder this time. Encouraged, expectant, the kind of laughter that feeds on someone else's discomfort. Clara stepped closer to the piano. The instrument itself looked like it had been forgotten by time, a cracked finish along its side, a few keys slightly misaligned, its presence more decorative than functional. A prop, not a performer. Perfect for a joke. As she reached out, her fingers hovered just above the keys, not touching them yet. From the outside, it looked like hesitation, like uncertainty, but something in the room shifted. Subtle, almost imperceptible. The air tightened. Conversation stopped. Even the quiet rustling of expensive fabric seemed to fade. Clara inhaled slowly, her shoulders rising just enough to catch the light, then settling again with deliberate calm. Her hand lowered. Not rushed, not unsure. Precise. And in that exact moment, before a single note had even been played, something deep in the room began to change, though no one could yet explain why. The melody did not rush, it did not try to impress, it simply unfolded with a quiet certainty that made every second feel intentional, as if each note had been waiting years for the exact moment it was finally allowed to exist. Clara's fingers moved across the worn keys with a calm precision that no one in that room could reconcile with the image they had formed of her just minutes ago. There was no hesitation left, no trace of uncertainty, only control, the kind that does not need to prove itself because it already knows its place. The sound filled every corner of the theater, reaching the high balconies and the shadowed edges of the room, wrapping itself around the audience in a way that made movement feel unnecessary, almost disrespectful. A man who had been checking his watch earlier now sat completely still, his hand frozen mid-motion, forgotten. A woman near the center row slowly lowered her phone, the screen dimming as her attention shifted fully to the stage, her expression no longer amused but searching, as if trying to understand something just beyond her grasp. Clara's left hand deepened the harmony, grounding the melody with a richness that should not have been possible from an instrument that had been dismissed as broken, and yet there it was, full, resonant, alive. It was not just the music that had changed, it was the room itself. The air felt heavier, thicker, as though the space had adjusted to accommodate something greater than what it had expected to hold. Daniel stood still now, no longer moving forward, no longer performing for the audience, his presence reduced to that of a spectator in his own event. His eyes remained fixed on Clara's hands, watching each movement with growing disbelief, searching for a mistake, a flaw, something that would restore the balance he had lost, but none came. Instead, what he saw was consistency, discipline, an understanding so deep it could not have been learned casually or recently. It was the kind of mastery that takes years, decades even, built in silence, away from rooms like this one. Clara's expression remained composed, her gaze steady, not lifted toward the audience, not lowered in submission, simply focused on the keys as if nothing else existed. And yet, there was something else. There now, something subtle but undeniable, a quiet authority that had replaced the invisibility she carried when she first stepped onto the stage. It did not demand attention, it commanded it without effort. A faint shift moved through the audience as people began to look at one another, their earlier confidence dissolving into uncertainty, into realization. They had misjudged her. Not slightly, not harmlessly, but completely. And that realization settled in slowly, like a weight they had not anticipated carrying. Clara's tempo shifted, not faster, not louder, but more intricate, weaving layers of sound that revealed a complexity no one had expected to witness, especially not from someone they had dismissed so easily. The piano responded to her in ways that defied explanation, each note aligned, each transition seamless, as though the instrument itself had been waiting for her specifically, not just any player, but her. In the back of the room, an older man who had attended concerts for decades leaned forward with narrowed eyes, his expression sharpening into recognition, though he did not speak, not yet. He simply listened more closely, as if confirming something he was not ready to say out loud. The final sequence of notes approached, not with grandeur, but with quiet inevitability, the kind that does not announce itself but leaves no doubt when it arrives. Clara's hands slowed slightly, each note given space, given weight, until the last tone lingered in the air, stretching just long enough to be felt before it faded. And when it did, nothing replaced it. No applause, no whisper, no movement. The room did not react because it could not. It was not shock alone that held them there. It was something deeper, something harder to admit. The understanding that in a matter of moments, everything they believed about her had been undone, and there was no easy way to pretend it had not happened. For a few seconds that felt longer than anyone could measure, no one moved, no one spoke, no one even seemed to breathe, as if the entire theater had been suspended in a moment that refused to release them. The silence was not empty, it was full, heavy with realization, pressing down on every person in the room. Clara's hands rested gently above the keys, no longer playing, no longer proving anything, simply still, as if what needed to be said had already been said. The last note had faded, but its presence remained, echoing somewhere deeper than sound. Daniel Hargrove stood just steps away, his expression frozen in a way that no performance training could disguise. The confidence that once defined him had thinned, replaced by something far less controlled, something closer to uncertainty. His mouth parted slightly, as if to speak, but no words came. For the first time that evening, he did not know what to say. A chair shifted quietly in the audience, the faint sound breaking the stillness just enough to remind everyone that time had not actually stopped, even if it felt like it had. Then another subtle movement, a breath, a blink, small signs that the room was beginning to return to itself. But nothing returned the way it had been. An older man in the third row slowly leaned back, his eyes still fixed on Clara, his expression no longer questioning but certain. He had seen something like this before, not often, not in years, but enough to recognize it when it appeared. Real mastery does not announce itself, it reveals itself. And what he had just witnessed was not an accident. A woman near the aisle brought her hand to her chest, as if steadying herself, her earlier amusement now replaced with something that looked like regret. She had laughed. She remembered it clearly. And now that memory felt different, heavier, harder to justify. One by one, the audience began to look at Clara not as they had before, not as background, not as a curiosity, but as the center of the moment they had all just experienced. The shift was quiet, but undeniable. Clara finally lifted her gaze, not dramatically, not with intention to command, but simply because the moment had ended. Her eyes moved across the room slowly, not searching for approval, not demanding recognition, just observing. Calm, steady, certain. She did not smile. She did not bow. She did not explain. She did not need to. Daniel took a step forward, the movement hesitant, as though he were stepping into unfamiliar territory. His voice, when it finally came, lacked the smooth certainty it had carried before. That was, he stopped, the sentence unfinished, the words insufficient for what had just occurred. He glanced at the piano, then back at Clara, as if trying to connect the two in a way that made sense, but the explanation he wanted was not available to him. Clara looked at him briefly, her expression unchanged, then shifted her attention back to the piano, gently lowering the fallboard with a soft, controlled motion. The sound of it closing echoed lightly, a quiet punctuation to a moment that had already been sealed. Somewhere in the audience, a single pair of hands came together in applause, hesitant at first, uncertain. Then another followed, and another. The sound grew, not explosive, not immediate, but building, genuine, spreading through the room as people began to respond not out of obligation, but out of recognition. It was not the kind of applause given to a performance expected, it was the kind given when expectations are completely undone. Daniel did not join in right away. He stood there, watching as the room shifted around him, as the attention he once controlled moved entirely away from him and settled on someone he had dismissed moments earlier. And in that realization, something settled in his expression, something quieter, heavier. Not anger, not embarrassment. Something closer to understanding, though incomplete. Clara stepped back from the piano, her movements as simple and unassuming as when she first arrived, as if nothing extraordinary had just taken place. But the room knew better now. They all did. And in that quiet understanding, the balance of the evening had changed in a way that could not be undone. The applause did not fade quickly. It lingered, rolling through the theater in steady waves, not overwhelming but persistent, as if the audience needed time to fully acknowledge what they had just witnessed. Clara stood quietly at the edge of the piano, her hands resting loosely at her sides, her posture unchanged, her presence still as calm as when she first stepped onto the stage. She did not react to the applause in the way performers usually did. There was no bow, no gesture of gratitude, only a quiet acceptance that the moment had already passed. The recognition was not what mattered. It never had been. Daniel Hargrove finally brought his hands together, but his applause came later than everyone else's, softer, measured, as though he were still catching up to something the rest of the room had already understood. His eyes remained fixed on Clara, no longer evaluating, no longer dismissing, but searching, trying to reconcile the woman he thought he saw with the one now standing in front of him. "Who are you?" he asked, the question escaping before he could refine it, his voice carrying just enough to be heard beyond the stage. The room quieted again, not completely, but enough for the question to settle into the space between them. Clara turned her head slightly toward him, her expression steady, not surprised by the question, not rushed to answer it. For a moment, it seemed like she might say nothing at all. Then, in a voice that was soft but clear, she spoke. "Someone who used to play," she said simply. No elaboration, no explanation. The answer hung in the air, incomplete to those who wanted details, but sufficient for those who understood that some stories do not need to be told out loud to be real. A subtle murmur moved through the audience, Not confusion this time, but recognition that there was more beneath the surface than they had been allowed to see. The older man in the third row leaned forward again, his eyes narrowing slightly, and then, almost to himself, he whispered a name, barely audible, yet somehow it carried. Whitmore. The word seemed to ripple outward, catching in the awareness of a few others nearby, then spreading slowly, cautiously, like a memory being reawakened. Clara Whitmore. The name did not belong to the present. It belonged to something older, something that had once held attention on stages far larger than this one. Years ago, that name had been spoken with admiration, with expectation, with certainty. And then, just as suddenly as it had risen, it had disappeared. No farewell performance. No explanation. Just silence. Daniel's expression shifted again, the recognition arriving not all at once, but in pieces, as if his mind were assembling a puzzle he had not realized he was holding. That is not possible, he said quietly, though there was no conviction behind it. Clara met his gaze briefly, not challenging him, not confirming anything, simply allowing the truth to exist without forcing it. It has been a long time, she replied. The simplicity of her words carried more weight than any explanation could have. Around them, the audience's reaction deepened, the applause no longer just appreciation, but something closer to respect, even humility. They were not just witnessing talent. They were witnessing history, rediscovered in the most unexpected way. Daniel took another step closer, but this time there was no authority in his movement, no sense of control, only curiosity, and perhaps something else, something quieter. Regret. Why would you? He began, then stopped, the question incomplete, because whatever answer he sought would not undo what had already happened. Clara looked down at the piano one last time, her fingers brushing lightly across its surface, not playing, just acknowledging. Because not everything needs an audience, she said. The words settled into the room with a quiet finality, more powerful than any performance. And in that moment, the contrast became undeniable, not between talent and ignorance, but between noise and substance, between being seen and being understood. Clara stepped away from the piano, her movements returning to their earlier simplicity, as if she were once again just a woman finishing her work. But no one in that room saw her that way anymore. And Daniel Hargrove, standing under the same lights that once defined him, understood something he had not expected to learn that night. That true mastery does not need to announce itself, and the loudest voice in the room is not always the one worth remembering. The applause slowly softened, not because the audience had lost interest, but because something more thoughtful had begun to take its place, a kind of quiet reflection that settled into the room like a second presence. People were no longer simply reacting, they were processing, reconsidering, recalibrating everything they had assumed just minutes earlier. Clara continued walking away from the piano with the same steady pace she had always carried, her steps light against the polished floor, her gaze forward, not lingering on the crowd that now watched her with a completely different kind of attention. It was not admiration in the loud, exaggerated way they had given Daniel earlier. It was something quieter, something more sincere, and perhaps more difficult to express. Daniel remained where he stood, his hands now at his sides, the stage lights still resting on him, but no longer defining him. He glanced briefly at the audience, noticing the shift, noticing how their focus had moved, how their expectations had been rewritten without warning. For someone who had built his reputation on control, on precision, on knowing exactly how a room would respond, this moment felt unfamiliar in a way that unsettled him. "Wait," he said, his voice firmer now, not commanding, but searching, as Clara reached the edge of the stage. She paused, not turning immediately, giving the moment space, as if allowing him to decide what he truly wanted to say. Daniel took a step closer, his expression no longer guarded by performance, but open, uncertain in a way that revealed more than he intended. "If that was you," he continued, choosing his words carefully, "if you really are who they think you are, then why disappear?" The question carried through the room, and once again, the audience leaned in, not out of curiosity for spectacle, but for understanding. Clara turned slightly, enough to face him, her expression unchanged, her eyes steady. For a brief second, the silence returned, not heavy this time, but expectant. Because I was finished, she said. The answer was simple, but it did not feel incomplete. It felt final. Daniel frowned slightly, not out of disagreement, but because the answer did not fit into the framework he understood. Finished, he repeated, as if testing the word. Clara nodded once, her movements calm, deliberate. Not everything needs to last forever, she added, her voice even. Some things are meant to. And when they have said what they needed to say. The audience absorbed her words in silence, the meaning settling differently for each person, depending on what they had believed before. Daniel looked at the piano again, then back at Clara, his thoughts moving quickly, trying to reconcile ambition with restraint, recognition with absence. But you could have had everything, he said, not as a challenge, but as a statement of fact from his perspective. Clara's gaze softened slightly, not in disagreement, but in understanding of the difference between what could be gained and what could be kept. I did, she replied. That was all. No list of achievements. No explanation of loss. Just certainty. The kind that does not need validation. A quiet shift moved through the audience again, but this time it was not surprise or confusion. It was realization, the kind that lingers longer than applause, the kind that changes how people see things after they leave the room. Daniel exhaled slowly, the tension in his posture easing, not because he had found all the answers, but because he had begun to understand the question itself. For the first time that evening, he was not thinking about performance or reputation or control. He was thinking about something simpler and perhaps more difficult, what it meant to truly know when enough was enough. Clara turned fully now, continuing toward the exit without waiting for further response, her steps quiet, consistent, unaffected by the weight of the moment she was leaving behind. The theater remained still as she moved, not out of obligation, but out of respect that had formed naturally, without being asked. And as she reached the doorway, the golden light catching her silhouette for just a second before she passed beyond it, the room understood something that could not be taught from a stage, that greatness is not defined by how long it is seen, but by how deeply it is remembered. The door closed softly behind Clara, and for a moment, the sound seemed louder than anything that had come before it, not because of its volume, but because of what it marked, the end of something the room was not ready to let go of. The golden light that had briefly outlined her figure disappeared, leaving the stage exactly as it had been before, and yet nothing felt the same. The audience remained seated, their attention still fixed on the space she had just left, as if expecting her to return, as if the moment had not fully completed itself. Daniel Hargrove stood motionless under the lights, the same lights that had once defined his presence now exposing the shift that had taken place within him. He looked toward the exit, his expression thoughtful, no longer searching for control, but for understanding that seemed just out of reach. A faint murmur moved through the audience, not the careless whispers from earlier, but quiet conversations layered with realization, people piecing together fragments of memory, connecting the name they had heard with performances they had once admired, recordings they had listened to years ago, stories they had half forgotten until now. Clara Whitmore was no longer just a possibility. She was a fact, and that fact carried weight. An event coordinator near the side of the stage stepped forward hesitantly, glancing between Daniel and the audience, unsure of how to proceed. The program had been interrupted in a way that could not be planned for, and yet no one seemed interested in returning to what had been scheduled. Daniel finally exhaled, the sound subtle but noticeable in the quiet, and turned slowly back toward the piano. The instrument sat exactly where it had been, unchanged in appearance, still worn, still imperfect, and yet no one in that room could see it the same way anymore. He approached it carefully, as if it might reveal something else if he looked closely enough. His hand hovered above the keys, mirroring the moment Clara had created earlier, but the similarity ended there. When he pressed a note, the sound that followed was thin, slightly uneven, exactly what everyone had expected from a neglected instrument. The contrast was immediate, clear, unavoidable. Daniel's hand paused, then lowered back to his side. He did not attempt another note. He did not need to. The point had already been made, not by him, but through him. A few people in the audience exchanged glances, not with judgment, but with a quiet understanding that something had been revealed that could not be undone. Daniel turned away from the piano, stepping back into the center of the stage, his posture no longer defined by performance, but by reflection. "We will take a short intermission," he said, his voice steady, though softer than before. There was no resistance from the audience, no impatience, only a shared agreement that what had just happened deserved space, deserved time. People began to rise slowly, conversations forming in low tones, not about the event they had come for, but about the moment they had just experienced. Names were spoken carefully, almost reverently. Memories were revisited. Assumptions were reconsidered. And through it all, one realization remained constant. They had witnessed something rare, something real, something that could not be replicated or rehearsed. Daniel stepped off the stage, moving toward the same direction Clara had taken, though his pace was slower, more deliberate. He did not know if he would find her, or if he even should, but the thought remained, not driven by ego, not by curiosity alone, but by something deeper, a need to understand what it meant to carry that kind of quiet certainty, that kind of restraint. As he reached the edge of the stage, he paused, glancing back one last time at the piano, at the space where everything had shifted, at the audience still processing what they had seen. And in that brief pause, it became clear that the evening would be remembered not for the performance that had been planned, but for the moment that had not been expected, the moment when everything loud had fallen away, and something quiet had taken its place, leaving behind a silence that spoke louder than anything that had come before. The hallway outside the theater felt different from the grand room behind it, quieter, dimmer, stripped of the polished performance that had defined the evening, and yet somehow more real. The soft hum of overhead lights replaced the echo of applause, and the faint scent of polished wood gave way to something simpler, something ordinary. Clara Whitmore walked at an unhurried pace, her footsteps steady against the carpeted floor, her expression unchanged, as if nothing extraordinary had just taken place, as if she had not just shifted the entire weight of a room filled with expectation and pride. Behind her, the distant murmur of the audience faded further with each step, replaced by silence that felt earned rather than empty. She reached a side corridor near the service entrance, the kind of place no one in formal attire ever noticed, where utility replaced elegance and purpose replaced appearance. A small maintenance cart stood against the wall, a folded cloth resting neatly on its surface, exactly where she had left it before everything changed. Clara paused for a moment, her hand resting lightly on the handle, grounding herself in something familiar, something that did not require explanation or recognition. The door behind her opened softly, and the sound of footsteps followed, measured, hesitant. Daniel Hargrove stopped a few feet away, not close enough to intrude, but not distant enough to remain detached. The difference in space between them was no longer defined by status, but by understanding still in progress. "I thought I might find you here," he said quietly, his voice no longer shaped for an audience, but for a conversation that did not need witnesses. Clara did not turn immediately. She adjusted the cloth on the cart with a small, deliberate motion, then looked over her shoulder, acknowledging his presence without surprise. "Most people do not look in places like this," she replied, her tone calm, not dismissive, simply factual. Daniel allowed a faint, almost self-aware smile to pass across his face, not out of amusement, but recognition of the truth in her words. He took a small step forward, his posture open, his expression no longer guarded by certainty. "I owe you an apology," he said, the words direct, unembellished, carrying none of the performance that once defined him. Clara studied him briefly, not evaluating, not judging, simply listening. "You owe yourself understanding," she answered, her voice even. "That will last longer than an apology." The statement settled between them, not harsh, not gentle, but accurate. Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing it, not resisting it. He glanced down at his hands, then back at her, as if recalibrating how to speak without the certainty he once relied on. "I have spent years learning how to control a room," he admitted, his tone thoughtful. "But I have never seen someone change one without trying." Clara's gaze softened slightly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of the shift he was beginning to make. "Control is loud," she said. "Understanding is quiet." The simplicity of the contrast carried more weight than any lecture could have. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and the silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was reflective, giving space for something deeper than words to take shape. From the far end of the hallway, a distant door closed, the sound echoing lightly, reminding them both that the evening was still unfolding beyond this moment. Daniel exhaled slowly, his shoulders relaxing, not from defeat, but from release, as if he had set something down that he had been carrying for longer than he realized. "Will you come back?" he asked, the question quieter than anything he had said before, not driven by expectation, but by curiosity that no longer demanded an answer. Clara considered the question for a brief moment, her eyes steady, her expression unchanged. "I never left," she replied. The meaning was not literal, and he understood that. It was not about the stage, or the audience, or the recognition that came with either. It was about something constant, something that did not depend on being seen. Daniel nodded again, slower this time, the realization settling in fully, not as a sudden revelation, but as something that would stay with him long after the night ended. Clara turned back to the cart, her hand resting once more on its handle, ready to continue the work she had been doing before everything shifted, because to her, it had not shifted in the way it had for everyone else. And as Daniel stood there, watching her move forward without hesitation, without need for acknowledgement, he understood something that could not be taught from a stage or learned from applause, that true presence does not demand attention, it simply exists, and in its quiet certainty, it changes everything around it. When Daniel finally stepped back into the theater, the room had changed in a way that could not be undone, even though the lights, the stage, and the carefully arranged seats remained exactly as they were before. Conversations had quieted into something more thoughtful, more deliberate, as if the audience understood that returning to the original program would feel incomplete, almost unnecessary. The piano still sat at center stage, untouched since Clara had left it, its worn surface no longer dismissed, but regarded with a kind of quiet respect, as though it too had revealed something that could not be explained away. Daniel walked slowly across the stage, not to perform, not to reclaim attention, but simply to stand in the space where everything had shifted. He looked out at the audience, meeting their eyes not with practiced confidence, but with honesty that did not require perfection. "Some moments," he began, his voice steady but softer than before, "are not part of the program." A faint smile passed through a few faces in the crowd, not out of amusement, but recognition. He glanced briefly at the piano, then back to the audience. "And sometimes," he continued, "those are the only ones that matter." No applause followed immediately, no reaction at all, just a shared understanding settling into the room like a quiet agreement. Daniel stepped back, leaving the stage without another word, not because he had nothing left to say, but because he had finally learned that not everything needs to be said out loud. The evening did not resume as planned. The music that followed felt different, not diminished, but reframed, each note carrying the weight of what had already happened, each performance measured not by technique alone, but by something deeper that had been revealed in a single unexpected moment. And beyond the stage, in the quiet corridors and unnoticed corners of the building, Clara Whitmore continued her work without interruption, her movements steady, her presence unchanged, as if the world had not just paused to remember her name. To her, nothing had been restored, nothing had been proven, because nothing had ever been lost. She had never needed the stage to define her, and she did not need it now. But for everyone else, the shift remained, carried with them as they left the theater one by one, stepping out into the cool night air, their conversations softer, their thoughts heavier, their certainty replaced with something more open. Some would remember the performance for years, replaying the moment when everything they assumed had been quietly undone. Others would not recall every detail, but they would remember how it felt, the stillness, the silence, the realization that came without warning. And Daniel, standing just outside the theater doors, watched as the last of the audience disappeared into the city, his reflection faintly visible in the glass beside him. He did not look the same, not because his appearance had changed, but because something within him had shifted, something quieter, something more lasting. He understood now that recognition is not the same as value, that applause can fill a room but not define a person, and that the most powerful presence is often the one that does not ask to be seen. He took a slow breath, the cool air grounding him, and for the first time in a long time, He felt no need to perform, no need to control what came next. The night moved forward without him needing to shape it, and in that release, there was a kind of clarity he had not expected to find. Somewhere inside the building, a faint echo of music lingered, but it was no longer the center of the story. The center had shifted to something quieter, something harder to describe but impossible to forget. And as the city lights reflected softly across the street, and the world continued in its usual rhythm, one truth remained, steady and unspoken. That respect is never earned by being the loudest voice in the room, but by the quiet certainty of knowing exactly who you are, even when no one is watching. In this deeply emotional journey of touching stories, a simple woman is quietly humiliated by an elite performer who believes talent belongs only to those in the spotlight. What follows transforms the room into silence as the overlooked woman reveals a level of mastery no one expected, turning judgment into reflection and arrogance into quiet realization. Through powerful storytelling and cinematic tension, this narrative explores dignity, humility, and the unseen depth behind ordinary appearances. These touching stories highlight how the loudest voice is not always the strongest, and how true brilliance often chooses silence over recognition. As the confident performer confronts his own limitations and the simple woman walks away unchanged, the audience is left with a lasting lesson about respect and perception. This is one of those rare touching stories that stays with you, reminding viewers that greatness does not seek attention but commands it effortlessly. Among touching stories that redefine perspective, this story stands as a powerful reflection on character, identity, and quiet strength. If you appreciate meaningful and emotional storytelling, this collection of touching stories will leave a lasting impression.